imagine these incredible ancient temples just perched right on a cliff edge, stones that have seen centuries pass. Now, picture that stunning place becoming the center, the real flashpoint of a modern conflict. Not really a full war, but serious armed clashes, intense diplomatic tension lasting for years. Today, we're diving deep into that really complex Thailand-Cambodia border dispute. We're going to focus specifically on the Preah Vihear temple. Our goal here is to unpack its deep historical roots, get into the fiery modern events that brought it, well, global attention, and try to understand the surprising causes underneath it all. And maybe the most interesting part, figuring out who, perhaps unexpectedly, might have actually benefited from all this prolonged tension.
Yeah, and it's important to say up front, like you mentioned, while we often hear conflict or dispute, this wasn't, a total war. It was more a series of pretty intense armed skirmishes and significant diplomatic friction, mostly concentrated between the early 2000s and around 2013. But the origins, as you said, go way back, over a century. It's a fascinating look at how old grievances can just flare up again with very real consequences today.
Absolutely. And right at the heart of it all is the temple itself, Preah Vihear. It's this magnificent Angkorian structure, really dramatic, up on a cliff. But the geography is kind of paradoxical, isn't it? That's fundamental here. It sits on this height, apparently easier to get to from Thailand, yet it became the absolute focus of the border fight with Cambodia. Okay, let's unpack this. How did that happen?
Well, it really dives deep into the colonial era. France colonized Cambodia back in the 19th century, part of French Indochina.
Yeah.
And they were the ones drawing the maps. In 1907, France made maps that put Preah Vihear clearly inside Cambodian territory. Now, Thailand Siam, as it was then, they initially seemed to accept these maps. But later on, especially after independence, Thailand argued, well, maybe these maps weren't totally accurate, maybe not fully legally binding, and boom, you have conflicting claims once both were sovereign nations.
Right. So you've got these conflicting claims, these historical issues bubbling up. It feels almost inevitable it would end up on the world stage. Beyond just talks between the two countries, what pushed Cambodia to actually take it to the International Court of Justice?
That was the big moment in 1962. Cambodia went to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, looking for a final decision. And the court ruled pretty clearly. The temple itself belonged to Cambodia. But here's a crucial part for why the friction continued. Thailand, while sort of accepting the ruling on the building, never really bought into the decision about the land surrounding the temple. So that left this major unresolved point, just simmering, ready to ignite again later. The classic case, really, of a ruling meant to settle things.
Yeah.
But actually leaving just enough ambiguity, enough room for different interpretations to keep the conflict alive.
It is startling, though, how intensely it flared up again in this century. I mean, actual armed clashes, despite that 1962 ruling. What on earth triggered such a violent comeback decades later?
A huge trigger. Really, the main one for this modern phase was in 2008. UNESCO listed Preah Vihear as a World Heritage Site. But the application was Cambodia's. And that decision, even though it was about cultural preservation, it sparked major outrage in Thailand. Many Thais felt it just cemented Cambodia's claim over the whole area, not just the temple stones.
Ah, okay. So that listing poured fuel on the fire.
Exactly. And the immediate result, armed clashes. Quite serious ones in 2008, 2009, and then things got really bad in early 2011. And these weren't small incidents, We're talking heavy artillery fire, people getting killed, civilians having to flee their homes, real damage to infrastructure on both sides.
In 2011, you said that really stands out. Just how bad did the fighting get then?
It really does stand out. Between February and May 2011, the fighting just exploded in intensity. And it wasn't just around Preah Vihear anymore. It spread to two other temple sites nearby, Tamon and Takrabai. The level of violence was, frankly, alarming. Both sides were using mortars, artillery, and even cluster munitions.
Cluster munitions, wow.
Yeah, and those are banned by international convention because they're so indiscriminate they harm civilians long after conflicts end. Using them just showed how desperate and brutal things had become. The human cost was awful. More than 20 people died, thousands were displaced, losing their homes, everything.
So after all that, Cambodia went back to the ICJ in 2013. Trying to get clarification on the original 62 ruling. What happened then?
Yes, exactly. They asked for clarification. And the ICJ ruled again in 2013. They clarified that not just the temple, but also the area right around Preah Vihear, the promontory, belongs to Cambodia. And they ordered Thailand to pull its troops out of that specific zone. But, this brings up a really important point about international law versus nationalism. The ICJ rules definitively, right? But then domestic politicians, maybe on both sides, they find ways to reinterpret things. Protests whip up public feeling using these historical narratives. Effectively, they sometimes sidestep the court's power on the ground, and that can sadly lead to more violence.
That's a really critical point. So if we look past the fighting itself, past the court decisions, what were the deeper things driving this? What kept this conflict going for so long, even after rulings? What was really underneath it all?
Yeah, if we really dig down, there are probably three main drivers. First, like we touched on, ambiguous borders. The original border lines were just not clearly marked out, especially in that mountainous terrain, often following watersheds. So both sides could genuinely look at the old maps and interpret them differently. That created, actual grounds for dispute that were hard to easily fix.
Okay, so genuine uncertainty was part of it.
Definitely. Second, and this is maybe the most powerful driver, nationalism. Politicians on both sides got very good at using this temple dispute. They used it to fire up support at home, often framing it as defending sacred national heritage, national sovereignty. It became a really handy tool, frankly, to distract from maybe internal political problems or economic issues. So they deliberately ramp up tension for political benefit. And third, that UNESCO listing and the whole sovereignty issue. When UNESCO listed it under Cambodia's name, even with good intentions for preservation, for many in Thailand, it felt like a direct affront. It hit these really deep-seated nerves about national identity, who owns the heritage, who controls the land. It became much more than just rocks or ruins. It was a powerful symbol.
It's amazing, isn't it, how those things, fuzzy lines drawn maybe 100 years ago, intense national pride, and yeah, political games can fuel real conflict, even over what from the outside might seem like a relatively small patch of land. It makes you realize how pertinent history or interpretations of history can be, like a raw nerve.
Exactly right. It stopped being just about the physical temple and became all about the stories, the narratives woven around it. And those narratives, well, they're not fixed. They get retold, reshaped, especially when it suits someone politically, to rally people or shift focus. The temple was just such a potent symbol.
Okay, so now for that provocative question we mentioned at the start. Civilians suffered, soldiers fought, but who, maybe in ways we don't immediately think of, actually gained something from this long conflict? Because he said no direct foreign intervention, but there were definitely ripples, indirect beneficiaries far beyond just Thailand and Cambodia.
You're absolutely right. No foreign boots on the ground in that sense, but several players definitely saw indirect benefits. First, let's look at China. China already had pretty strong economic and military links with both countries, but during the conflict, they significantly ramped up arms sales, especially to Cambodia. And they also deepened Cambodia's economic dependence through more loans, more investment. As both sides looked for international friends, China skillfully played the role of a neutral, reliable partner and investor. And that really boosted its soft power, its influence right across Southeast Asia.
Interesting. So China kind of strengthened its position by being the steady hand economically and militarily, for Cambodia especially. Did that create any concerns, that dependency, during the conflict itself, or was it just seen as necessary?
Well, publicly, during the heat of it, concerns weren't loudly voiced, perhaps. For Cambodia, facing security issues, Chinese support, arms, money, it was very practical, almost essential, even if it meant deeper reliance. For Thailand, which also keeps strong ties with China, it just underlined the shifting power dynamics in the region. Okay, next, the United States. The U.S. obviously has major strategic interests in keeping ASEAN stable. They use the conflict arguably as a chance to bolster military ties with Thailand. Remember, Thailand is a treaty ally. And they also engage Cambodia diplomatically. Plus, the U.S. put significant funding into clearing landmines along the border. That projected a positive humanitarian image while still maintaining their regional presence and engagement.
And then there's the almost inevitable consequence of any conflict, sadly. Someone sells the weapons.
Absolutely. The global arms industry, they were clear, direct winners here. Both Thailand and Cambodia significantly increased their defense budgets during this period. Cambodia bought weapons mainly from China, also some Eastern European nations.
Sure.
Thailand tended to buy from Western suppliers, Europe, the U.S. So yeah, arms manufacturers directly profited from the increased insecurity, the demand for military gear.
Right.
And finally, maybe a bit surprising, but UNESCO and other international institutions also saw a kind of indirect boost. The whole dispute kept a global focus on, well, the importance of heritage diplomacy, the role of international law in settling these things, UNESCO's role, the ICJ's involvement. It kind of reinforced their relevance, their perceived authority in trying to manage global conflicts, even culturally charged ones.
It really is a stark reminder, isn't it, that even conflicts that seem quite localized, they send out these complex global ripples. And often, there are actors benefiting from the instability in ways that aren't immediately obvious. So let's bring it up to today. What's the situation now at the Preah border? Has it calmed down for good, or is it still, a potential flashpoint?
Well, since 2013, things have been much, much quieter.
Mm.
There hasn't been any major violence, which is obviously a huge relief. That said, the underlying tensions, they do still surface occasionally. Maybe around national holidays or during certain political moments, you might see a bit of rhetoric flare up. But largely, a demilitarized zone has been maintained around the temple area. And actually, both sides are cooperating more now, especially within the ASEAN framework, focusing on regional goals. So it's maybe best described as a fragile peace, but it's peace based on talking, on dialogue, rather than fighting, which is progress.
So what we've really unpacked today is this incredibly complex situation, the Thailand-Cambodia dispute over Preah Vihear. It's not a war in the classic sense, no, but it's a border conflict with incredibly deep historical roots, huge cultural weight, and as we've just discussed, these really surprising geopolitical dimensions that went far beyond the two main countries.
Yeah, and just to recap those indirect beneficiaries again, you had China skillfully boosting its regional influence in arms sales. You had the U.S. and other Western powers reinforcing alliances, benefiting their defense industries. International bodies like the UN, ICJ, UNESCO saw their roles highlighted. And of course, the global arms dealers making direct profits. It's quite a sobering thought, isn't it? That while global powers and industries found ways to gain, it was ultimately the ordinary people, the civilians on both sides of that border, who bore the real cost.
It really makes you think, what does this whole Preah story tell us about the hidden costs and maybe the hidden winners of these so-called limited conflicts in our world today? And maybe how often do we really look past the headlines, past the immediate fighting to see who else might be benefiting when tensions rise somewhere? Definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Subscribe for more.